Welcome to lab number 22. That's the endocrine system. The main goal for the lab activities associated with the endocrine system will be to identify the gross anatomy of the main endocrine glands. So being able to identify the pituitary gland, the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and the gonads, which are responsible for releasing hormones. So being able to identify that gross anatomy, as well as being able to identify selected histology, that is tissues and specific types of cells underneath the microscope. So what is an endocrine gland and how is it different from an exocrine gland? They share some similarities. They both develop from epithelial tissue that's secretory. And on the left there is an example of an exocrine gland, one that has a duct that allows it to secrete its product locally, that is out onto the surface of the skin, into the digestive system, wherever. On the right is an endocrine gland, and it's formed the same way with epithelial tissue that's secretory, but it's a ductless gland. It doesn't have a connection to the surface. Instead, its products are secreted into the interstitial fluid and from there into the bloodstream where they can affect cells that are pretty far away. So exocrine glands have local activity. Endocrine glands can have universal activity across the body in any cells that have receptors for them. The secretions that endocrine glands make are called hormones. These are the chemicals that they use to communicate. The endocrine system uses really similar signal transmission as the nervous system. That is, it has one cell that's causing a response and target cells that have receptors for that response to have a response. So up there at the top is neural transmission. There's an electrical signal that's sent down the length of a neuron. That neuron releases a neurotransmitter into the synapse, a very short distance between it and the target cell. And that neurotransmitter binds to receptors on the target cell, causing a response. In the bottom here, we have an endocrine cell that's releasing a, there it is, the endocrine cell, and it's releasing a chemical into the blood, into the interstitial space, and then into the bloodstream. That chemical is a hormone, and that chemical travels through the bloodstream, and it passes by cells without receptors for that particular hormone, which elicits no response. But for cells that have receptors, it causes a response. So the advantage to this endocrine hormone transmission is you can have one cell that affects target cells all throughout the body, so you can get a much broader response. It's also a much slower response because these need to travel across long distances. So these effects are going to remain until that hormone is metabolized or inactivated by the body. So if a lot of different activities need to be orchestrated at the same time and across broad distances, this is where endocrine system is going to come into play. So the major endocrine glands, the first one is the pituitary gland. It's called the master endocrine gland because it makes 9 separate hormones and it has influence over the activity of other endocrine tissues. Even though it seems really impressive, it's controlled by the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is this section of nervous tissue up here. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland dangling below it. And the pituitary sits in that sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, and it's divided up into 2 main lobes, that is the anterior and the posterior pituitary. So the anterior is going to be this one over here on the left, and the posterior is this one over here on the right. So the anterior pituitary is of epithelial origin, and then the posterior pituitary is derived from neural tissues. So they actually have different derivations across development. So the pituitary is divided up into that anterior and that posterior portion. So again, anterior and posterior. The anterior is what's responsible for secreting 6 of the 9 hormones, and it's controlled by hormones that are secreted from the hypothalamus into a vascular network, and those carry the hormones through the infundibulum and into the anterior pituitary, and they're secreted from there. In the posterior pituitary, this causes the release of 2 different hormones. And these 2 different hormones are produced within the hypothalamus. And there are nerve fibers that travel into the posterior pituitary and cause their release from there. So the anterior pituitary is this 2-step process, and the posterior pituitary is the 1-step process. So here's an illustration showing this. The anterior pituitary on the left side of the screen. And you can see that there are blood vessels that travel into the anterior pituitary, carrying hormones that are released from the hypothalamus and causing the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Whereas on the right side there, in the posterior pituitary, and this is neurons that are coming directly into and secreting their hormones directly into the bloodstream from that posterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary, epithelial origin, requires this 2-step process to release hormones. Posterior pituitary, it's of neural origin, and it's a 1-step process to release those hormones. And here's a summary of some of these hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary and by the posterior pituitary. You do need to know some of these because they are on your list. And these are things that we're going to go over more in the lecture section. So I'm not going to spend any time talking about specific hormones during the lab portion. So the next one to know is the pineal gland, and it's shown here in fuchsia. This pineal gland is located right here at the posterior roof of the 3rd ventricle. And in the absence of light, this gland is responsible for secreting the hormone melatonin. Melatonin helps to regulate the body's internal clock. So there's the pineal gland over here in fuchsia in relation to the hypothalamus, shown in yellow, and the pituitary dangling below it with the anterior and the posterior portions. The next one to be able to identify is the thyroid gland. So right now we have a blown up view of somebody's cervical region. You're looking at the trachea and the larynx here. This cartilage right here is the thyroid cartilage, also known as the Adam's apple. And the thyroid gland is this butterfly-shaped gland that's inferior to the thyroid cartilage. It's sort of hugging the trachea or the windpipe. And on the cadavers and on models, you'll see that it has this sort of cottage cheese appearance that's really characteristic of endocrine glands. It looks sort of like a lump of cottage cheese. And when you look at the thyroid gland underneath the microscope, you're going to see these really distinct ring-like structures. So they're organized into these gel-filled spheres. These open spaces are called follicles, and they're surrounded by this ring of follicular cells. So this ring of follicular cells is responsible for secreting the thyroid hormone. And cells in between the follicles, like these right here, are called C cells or parafollicular cells, and they're responsible for secreting calcitonin. So here's a closer up view. This open ring space is a whole follicle. Those cells that line the follicle are called the follicular cells. And these cells that are in the space between those open rings, those are the parafollicular or C cells. Here's another view of thyroid. This would be a follicle right here. The cells around the outside, this simple cuboidal epithelium specialized for secretion, is the follicular cells, and then the spaces between the follicles, those parafollicular or C cells. When you're looking at the histology of the thyroid gland, you'll see the follicles and you'll see the follicular cells, and then sometimes, whoa, you'll see this big, dark, dense mass in the slide of the thyroid tissue. This is a parathyroid gland. Now we're looking at a posterior view of the thyroid gland. And if you look there, then what you'd see are these 4 small pea-sized glands that are against the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. They produce parathyroid hormones. And when you look at them in histology, the best way to identify them is by looking at this big, dark, dense tissue that's surrounded by thyroid follicles. Down here at the very bottom, this is just parathyroid. It would be very difficult to identify if I showed it to you alone. So on an exam, I would always have an image that shows thyroid follicles interrupted by this parathyroid tissue. Again, here's the thyroid follicles with those follicular cells, C cells in between, and then whoa, this big dark dense mass, that's the parathyroid tissue. So when you see something that's a distinct pattern change like that, surrounded by thyroid tissue, that's parathyroid. Up next is the pancreas, which is primarily an exocrine gland. It primarily secretes digestive enzymes into the small intestine. So it primarily has exocrine function, but about 1% of it is endocrine. So we're going to learn about it in both endocrine and digestive systems. For its endocrine functions, it's responsible for secreting glucagon and responsible for secreting somatostatin. So it's responsible for insulin and glucagon and somatostatin. And again, it has this cottage cheesy appearance that is characteristic of an endocrine gland. And when we look at it on the cadavers, you're gonna be able to see it with this cottage cheese appearance. What does the pancreas look like under the microscope? This is another histology that you're gonna wanna be able to know. I said it's primarily exocrine tissue. So all of this stuff out here that's not circled in yellow, that's all exocrine tissue. But then when you see a pattern change, and you see something that looks like an island in this background tissue, that's going to be the islet of Langerhans, or it's called the pancreatic islet. And that contains the endocrine cells, the alpha cells and the beta cells that are responsible for secreting hormones that travel throughout the body. Exocrine, you will not need to identify underneath the microscope. You just need to be able to identify these islets of Langerhans, or their formal name now is the pancreatic islets. So in this slide, can you identify the pancreatic islets? Hopefully what you identified was, trying to find a pointer, this right here, which is a pancreatic islet. This is a pancreatic islet. And these are pancreatic islets, pancreatic islets, pancreatic islets. So structures that look distinct from the background. And here, there's just one big pancreatic islet. It is in the center there. So this right here is a pancreatic islet consisting of those endocrine cells, and it's all surrounded by exocrine tissues. Next up is the adrenal glands, or they're sometimes called the suprarenal glands because they're on top of the kidneys. Supra means above, renal refers to the kidneys. So they're composed of these 2 distinct areas that are responsible for secreting different hormones. They're functionally and structurally distinct. There's an outer cortex, Let me see if I can grab that outer cortex. So the outer cortex is this layer right here. And this layer right here. And then there's an inner medulla. And the inner medulla is this area in here. And this area in here. And on the very outer part, what you're seeing is the capsule that surrounds it. So there's a connective tissue capsule on the outside, and you'll see a connective tissue capsule on the outside on the slides. So here in this image, we're looking at up there at the top. Let me try to do the same colors. Up there at the top, all of this is the capsule, which isn't responsible for secreting any hormones. And then, let's see, this part right here, from here to here, that's going to be the cortex. The cortex is on the outside. And then where you see a distinct pattern change from here downward, that is going to be the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal cortex, it's responsible for secreting some hormones. The adrenal cortex, some hormones that are anti-inflammatory, secrete androgens, stimulate the kidneys to excrete potassium and conserve sodium. The adrenal medulla, that innermost part, is stimulated by that sympathetic nervous system, and it releases adrenaline. So your adrenaline is coming from your adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. The next ones to know are the gonads. The first one is the testes. The testes are located in the scrotum, and they're functioning to make sex cells as well as testosterone. And the cells that are responsible here are the seminiferous tubules. So if you see something that's organized around a center point like this, this is all the seminiferous tubules that are responsible for making sperm. And we're going to focus on those more when we get into the reproductive unit. So all of these are cells of the seminiferous tubules. But we're going to concern ourselves with the other cells here, again, the ones in the spaces. So these right here and these here, all of these are interstitial, or in the in-between spaces. These are interstitial cells or Leydig cells, and they're clustered between the seminiferous tubules. They're responsible for the production of testosterone. Last but not least is the ovaries that are located adjacent to the uterus. They're functioning to produce sex cells, that is eggs, and the sex hormones estrogen and progesterone. So things to look for here within the ovaries, some things that you'll be able to see are these follicles. So the follicles are the big open spaces that are present inside of the ovary tissue. And this is where one single egg cell, one oocyte, is developing. Those are the primary follicles inside the oocytes, and all around the border of those follicles, that's where you find the granulosa cells, or the follicular or the granulosa cells. Those are making estrogen. Progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is all of those follicular cells remaining after ovulation, and it helps to maintain the uterus during pregnancy. So the corpus luteum would be this big structure down here. This is the corpus luteum, and it's the follicular cells that remain after the egg has been expelled from the follicle. Other organs that serve an endocrine function, there are a lot of tissues and organs throughout the body that secrete some hormones. So they secrete chemicals that travel through the body and affect other tissues. So cells within the heart are responsible for secreting hormones that affect other tissues. So cells within the heart secrete atrial natriuretic hormone, which increases fluid loss of the kidney and reduces blood volume and pressure. The kidneys are receiving 20 to 25% of the cardiac output. They're maintaining the consistency of the blood. So they're releasing renin, which is not a true hormone, but it secretes, it causes the secretion of another hormone, angiotensin, which causes the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. And then all along the GI tract, there are tissues that secrete hormones, most of which are acting on other parts of the GI tract, so providing some of this feedback. So what you're going to want to do for Lab 22, you're going to want to read through Lab 22, complete the worksheets on page 9 and 10, and then go online and look for quizzes that provide you some of the histology, some of the what these tissues look like under the microscope. And I've provided a practice quiz link to that end. So check that out and let me know if you have any questions about endocrine glands or endocrine tissues.